Good morning and welcome to day 2 of Research Week 2025. Just a little bit of housekeeping, if you don't mind. If you could please put your phones on silent, just to give the presenters a chance of not being disturbed. It would be great. Also, there's photography and videography happening today, so if anybody does not want to take part in that or does not want to be included, you can contact any of our team. We're the people wearing the lovely Research Week 25 t-shirts. So I suppose thanks so much to Norma, James and Darren for putting this event together. It's a really great event and we're looking forward to hearing about MACSI's work in collaborating with both industry and academia. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Norma Bargary, who's your chair for today. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning. I'm going to give just a very brief background of MACSI for those of you who might not be familiar with us and what we do, and then I'll hand over to our lovely speakers who are going to tell you a bit about the work that they have done together. So I suppose MACSI has been around for nearly 20 years now, originally funded externally by Science Foundation Ireland, but has, I suppose, transitioned to being an internal research centre at the moment. We look at things from a variety of different aspects. So we have applied mathematicians, statisticians within MACSI, and we look at problems from 2 different aspects, I suppose. We have mathematical modelling side of things where you need to have fundamental knowledge of a process. We're talking about physical modelling of things, and we try and combine qualitative and quantitative information about the different systems that we're trying to model. Coupled with that, then, we have our purely data-driven knowledge generation through our statistical modelling and our data modelling, but that requires, I suppose, very good data collected and very fully exploit the quantitative information that you have. Sometimes we do both together, so we're trying to, I suppose, combine the best of both worlds in lots of our applications. But in some sense, it's either a data, a maths problem, or some hybrid of the two. So this slide, it's a little bit busy, but I suppose we have a reputation, and our original remit in MACSI was to work with industry. And I think when a lot of us think about industry, we think about the Dells and the J&Js and the analog devices. But actually, what our work is a lot broader than that. And I suppose one of the things that we'd like to get across today is just how broad the work that we do is. So we work, we do absolutely work a lot with industry, but of course we work with lots of partners who are both academic, who are, in government bodies, etc., as well. And you'll hear about some of that today. So rather than having me standing here talking to you about MACSI, we thought we'd move on to the good stuff. This is Tuckman's model. We thought this was great, a description of how we might actually collaborate with each other, so forming, hopefully not too much storming, norming, and then going back into the performing side of things. Okay, so we're going to start off with our pairs of collaborators here. First up, we have Associate Professor Sharon Mogadam from MACSI, and we have Professor Bill Watson from University College Dublin. Sharon is an Associate Professor in Statistics and Data Science with us in the Department of Maths and Stats here in UL, and her research interests are all about survival analysis, which is used to model time-to-event type data, Bayesian statistics, and machine learning, with particular interest in their applications in cancer research. Sharon worked as a postdoctoral researcher in UCD, where she collaborated with Bill, and Bill is a professor of cancer biology in the UCD School of Medicine. His team is looking at using state-of-the-art technologies to try and understand more about the cellular and molecular pathways that we need to understand how prostate cancer begins and develops in men. So the aim here really is to try and identify diagnostic and prognostic biomarkers and different therapeutic sites for manipulation in prostate cancer. So the project they're going to talk about today is part of this, and around the identification of new biomarkers to predict biochemical recurrence, which I'm sure they're going to tell you a little bit about in their talk, in prostate cancer patients.
Great. Thanks very much indeed for the invitation and to be here for your research week. It's a great pleasure and a fantastic pleasure to be able to share the podium with Sharon, who is a fantastic collaborator over the years. So we're here to talk about prostate cancer, and there are many dilemmas associated with both the detection and treatment of prostate cancer, and mainly associated with the fact that this is a very heterogeneous disease. So the gold standard for the diagnosis of prostate cancer is a biopsy. So if you took a biopsy here, for example, you wouldn't hit the tumours which are lurking in these nodes here. But if you took a biopsy here, well, you would hit the tumour. But maybe this is a tumour that is indolent and is not going to progress within the lifespan of the patient. So a clinical decision of treatment would be made on that basis. However, maybe the aggressive form of the disease is lurking here and this has been missed. So you can see that there are issues associated with the gold standard for the diagnosis of this sampling error. So what clinicians and patients need are serum biomarkers. Serum because the prostate lactates into serum and into the urine, and this would be a better overall representation of what's going on within this complex heterogeneous disease. The other thing that clinicians need, patients need, are better clinical decision-making tools. So incorporating these new biomarkers to help inform how they would make a decision. And this is informed by guidelines or being implemented by guidelines. The NCCN guidelines or the NICE guidelines in the UK are now advocating that we need to build these statistical decision-making models to help our clinicians and patients decide on what is the most appropriate treatment for them. And this is actually what our patients also want. We work very closely with our lived experience men who have been treated and are living with prostate cancer. And one of the main areas that they've identified that we need to focus our research in is around supporting treatment choices, because post-treatment they have regret over how they were treated, because there are many quality of life side effects that impact on their overall quality of life once they have been treated. So a number of years ago, before Sharon joined us, we undertook a review of all the clinical decision-making points along the paradigm for prostate cancer. First of all, determining whether a man needs to have a biopsy. And we worked also with Amir here to build a clinical decision-making model, which made it into the National Cancer Control Programme. And he now is doing research around refining and further developing this. This is determine whether you need a biopsy. But the work that we did with Sharon was at this latter point, because if a man is identified as having aggressive disease and it's confined to the prostate, then surgery or radiation represents the most appropriate treatment for these men. Unfortunately, about a third of these men will fail that therapy, indicating that the parameters at the time that were presented to the clinician and the patient weren't accurate, and the patient has ultimately failed. So I'm going to hand over to Sharon, who's going to talk about the modelling and how we developed and identified biomarkers to predict biochemical recurrence. Sharon?
So thanks, Norma, for the introduction, and thanks, Phil, for giving the basic ideas about the research question. And so as Norma mentioned, my collaboration with Bill started in 2017, where I joined his lab as a postdoctoral researcher. So as Bill mentioned, so the part that I was involved, it's about predicting the biochemical recurrence in prostate cancer after men had the surgery and the prostate has been taken out. So, which is kind of called a radical prostatectomy, and it's a curative treatment if the cancer is localized within the prostate, but 20 to 30% of the patient experience biochemical recurrence. And the current clinical variables to inform the outcomes, they are PSA, biopsy glycemic score, and clinical stage. And in collaboration with Professor Brandon Murphy and Dr. Amir Jalali, we developed a statistical model based on the clinical variables and also including serum biomarkers to predict biochemical recurrence pre-treatment to improve treatment decisions. So as I mentioned, the main idea is that to build a model which not only have the clinical variables, but also including a panel of serum biomarkers. So these serum biomarkers was selected based on the previous discovery in Professor Watson's lab. So for example, including CD14, ZAG, IG1, which most of them has recognized and as having a significant role in developing cancers. So we gathered data from Bowman, St. James and Mater Hospital in Dublin and validated in 2 independent Norwegian and Austrian cohorts. So we could see that by 5 years, around 18% of Irish patients will experience biochemical recurrence after the radical prostatectomy, and this number is much larger in Austrian and Norwegian cohort, which is around 37% and 75%. And based on the Kaplan-Meier plot, we can see that the median time of biochemical recurrence after surgery in Norwegian cohort, it's around 48 months, and in Austrian cohort, it's around 108 months. So we looked at different models, and one of the models that we looked at was the Cox regression models, and we looked at the linear and nonlinear effect of serum biomarkers. So we looked at we evaluate our model and looked at the clinical variables only, clinical and biomarkers, and also the classical 3-tier NCCN, which categorize the patient into low level, medium, and high level risk. And we figure out that adding the biomarker to the model, so which you can see it would be the blue line, which significantly improve the prediction. So in terms of, so in general, we build a model based on the data set of those 3 hospitals in Ireland and validate it on the Austrian and Norwegian cohort. So in terms of the discrimination, we looked at the receiver operative characteristic curve and decision curve analysis. And in order to see that if our prediction probabilities are close to the true ones, we look at the calibration plot. And you can see that in most of the plots, the blue line, which is the combined, so not only looking at the clinical one, which would be the red value, so when we, the red line, so when we are adding the serum biomarkers to the clinical value, so the prediction would be improved. So in terms of building a model, we looked at the 3-year and 5-year biochemical recurrence, but the validation data set that we have, there was a short time of the follow-up, so the only validation that we looked at the 3 years one. So, and we saw that adding the PEDF biomarker with the PSA, DRE, and biopsy Gleason score could improve the prediction accuracy of the model. And we figure out that patients with low level of PEDF are more likely to experience progression of the prostate cancer leading to biochemical recurrence. So this would help clinicians and patients to kind of improve the treatment decision making, and the clinician could identify pre-treatment and primary treatment in advance of the any surgery to decide that either they want to go to, for example, with the primary treatment or adjuvant therapy, and this could help to improve the patient outcome and also the patient quality of life. So mostly like any research, there are some challenges. So in terms of the statistical part, so there was always challenges of the data, the missing data, and also the censoring one. because the data set was, so before I joined the project, so the data set was gathered, but not the information about the time to biochemical recurrence. So we needed to contact the hospital, so the nurses needed to contact the patient to get the information. And as you can see that, we had the problem of the time to follow up. And also, as I told you, so we were building a model on the Irish cohort, as you see that around 18% were have biochemical recurrence, and we tried to validate that in a cohort that they had 75% biochemical recurrence. So the kind of the validation set that we were used, that was not kind of the similar structure than our data set. So it was one of the challengings. So I will pass to Bill for more clinical challenging of the collaboration.
Well, I suppose it's more as a scientist and a clinician. When we engaged with Sharon, it was trying to the terminology. So I've learned a huge amount over the years on working closely with Sharon and with Amir around the type of terminology. But the other, I think, main point that I wanted to raise around challenges is when is the appropriate time to engage with statisticians? And I think it has to be at the beginning of the project. And that then raises the question around, well, when we apply for funding, we put a Gantt chart together and we say, oh, we'll do the statistics at the end and we'll hire a statistician at the end. But of course, you need them at the beginning. So I think that opens up the question around asking our funding bodies to invest in these people earlier. But then the question is what do you do when you're gathering the data and doing all the biomarker work? What should they be doing? So anyway, those are just two sort of reflections. And then sample size, trying to gather high quality data from large groups of patients within a very fragmented and dispersed healthcare system as we have in Ireland. But actually, we have a pretty good healthcare system here compared to other jurisdictions, and trying to find other validation cohorts that have the same quality samples and data is also challenging. So, decision-making tools are going to be the future. We talked about the role of AI, what we should be teaching our medical students. I think we want to make sure they understand where data comes from and the quality of that data, but these tools are going to help them into the future to present information to patients, and then those patients can make a decision. And then, obviously, moving forward.
Yes, and so we are working on a grant application now, which is the SFI US Ireland, and hopefully it will get funded and then.
Yeah. And the important point is that Sharon is involved at the very, very beginning. So happy to take any questions.
Yes.
So I guess as chair, I invite a few questions, or if anybody has any queries.
Sorry. Two quick questions. Did you ever get to the bottom of why the Norwegians and Austrians had such high recurrence rates? And also, how are you using the low PEDF readings to inform clinical decisions now?
So I'll do the
Yes.
Norwegian, and you can. So we have. So trying to find other validation cohorts. We went with an Austrian and Norwegian because of their genetic background, but Norway has a very rural. Coastal sort of region, so the time by which men present for their treatment is further along the paradigm of progression of disease. So they usually present with higher disease, which is more likely then to progress. Eastern Ireland, men are in a more urban setting and are more likely to engage with their GPs, so are presenting earlier in the stage, so are treated earlier and have better outcomes. So that's the main reason. They also have different healthcare systems. We've seen something similar east and west of Ireland as well, that men that are diagnosed in the west of Ireland have higher biochemical recurrence because of the rural nature and their engagement with the healthcare system, so they're presenting later.
So the other part of the challenge was that the validation set was not kind of balanced. So what the other thing that we did was that combining all the cohorts together and putting a percentage as the trained set and test on the other ones, and still we see that the PEDF is an important biomarker, and we saw that, so it has a kind of negative effect. So if, for example, a patient went and they take the blood test and see that the PEDF is kind of low level in their blood, so it could be a sign that there is a higher chance that they're developing biochemical recurrence.
But we're using that in combination with other biomarkers, also in urine, and so I think it won't be one individual biomarker like PSA, and it'll be a combination and panel. That's again why we need clinical decision-making tools to combine these.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Associate Professor Padraig McCarron from MACSI and Gail Cleon from the School of English, Irish and Communication here at UL. Padraig's an Associate Professor in Applied Mathematics, and his research is really about social networks and identifying properties of those to try and develop realistic models of social phenomena. He's worked on a whole host of different application areas, polarisation and attitude networks, criminal social networks, trust partnership networks, but he's also very interested in Irish mythology and the development of literature networks to describe key characters in there. So I guess that's what led to the work with Gail, who is a doctoral candidate still currently, are you? Yes. In the School of English, Irish and Communication. And her research is all about the study of 13th and 14th century Irish bardic poetry. And I suppose her work with Padraig really has centred on gathering data on social networks and character interactions within the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology. So we'd welcome Padraig and Gail.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Norma. So this project is called Navain. So if you remember you're Irish, you imagine there's a chevu above this M. So Navain is one of 3 Irish goddesses associated with kind of war, and is represented by a crow or a raven. And in particular, she's associated with chaos. So I thought that was a fairly important spirit to channel for this kind of work. So yeah, as Norma mentioned, my work is on complex networks or complex systems. So a complex system is something which has many objects, many bodies, but the properties that emerge from that are not necessarily trivial. So if you study the anatomy of a bird or the behavior of a single bird, but then you observe something like a murmuration, like in this photo here, or certain flock behavior, that's not something that you would have predicted necessarily from a single constituent. So complex systems have these emergent properties. In particular, I work in complex networks. So these are complex systems in which you have a specific interaction between any object in that network. This is a snapshot of the internet, for example. In complex networks, one of the emergent properties there is there's a very small number of steps between any 2 objects. So you might have heard of the idea of 6 degrees of separation. This is the idea that if, on average, you can get it from a chain of friends, you can get to anybody in the world within 6 steps. And that's a property that, again, you wouldn't necessarily expect, but is a result of studying complex networks. And it's in particular social networks that I work on. So social networks are a particular type of complex network. They have a few properties distinguishing them from other networks, such as the fact that people like to associate with people similar to themselves, whether that's of a similar age or ethnicity, or even things like social class or religion. And in social networks, you have people, and then there's some kind of interaction between them. So that kind of interaction can depend on what you're dealing with. And I don't want to define too many terms, but just things I'm going to use. The main things I'm going to be interested here when we look at some network diagrams is things like the number of neighbours. So if you look at these pink nodes here, these have the highest number of neighbours or the highest degree in these networks. And then I'm also interested in this sort of global property, which is the betweenness, or it requires the full network structure. So if you look at the betweenness centrality of this blue node, he's got the highest betweenness. So if you were to pass information from, say, any node in this cluster here, if that information had to get to someone in this cluster or this cluster, it has to pass through this blue node. So by knowing all the paths, if you lie in the shortest path, you have a high betweenness centrality. And we find that in our networks that correlates very strongly with importance in stories. So just some examples of social networks I've worked on. This is a mobile phone network. This is a European operator. They have about 1/5 coverage of the country they're in. And there's about 35 million people on this in this data set. about 6 billion calls in 2007. So the blue nodes here, they're males, the red are females, and the grey are people on different operators. So if somebody in our operator calls someone on another operator, we have that information, or if they call them back. But if these two nodes call each other, we don't have that information. So it's quite incomplete. And then the numbers here are the age of the people, and the numbers between them and the interactions here is the number of calls they make. So this is like a married couple, a 56-year-old male who married to a 50-year-old female. They ring each other almost every day. They've got a 23-year-old daughter who, as you can see, has got a boyfriend of the same age. And they've got a son who they don't like as much. So that's some of the data sets I've worked on in the past. I've also worked on opinion networks. This is like through political polarization, similar to what David and Paul will talk about later. And what I'm most interested in for this project is this idea of literature networks. So this network here I'm showing is from Homer's Iliad. So in this network, each blue node is a character that appears in it, so I need to know specific characters. And then a grey interaction is just some kind of social interaction, or it's clear from the text they know each other at least. And a red interaction is where they fight, they meet on the battlefield. So the Iliad is a story of a few weeks around the siege of Troy, and it deals with Hector's kind of defense of Troy and the Greeks trying to attack it. And you can see these are the Trojan characters here, these are the Greek characters. There's lots of gods and mythical creatures in this, and as long as they talk or interact, they're included in this network. Okay, so in my previous work, I would have looked at different social networks from different cultures, from different myths and epics, and compared them to sort of see if some have influence over other ones. But as I was doing it, I was always much more interested in the Irish stuff. And I kind of had an idea to combine like all these Irish myths and make a large network and analyze that. But I knew it was going to be very, very challenging. And but I always had the idea in the back of my head. So a few years ago, I came up with the idea that if there's hundreds of different Irish myths and legends, and if you were to merge a social network of all these, the sort of supernatural characters or the god characters who are never the actual protagonists in these stories, they'll never have a particularly high centrality. But because they appear in many different stories, when you start creating a larger network, they'll be between us will increase, or their centrality will get higher because they connect a lot of different stories. So that was the idea I had, and then I'll invite you, Gail, to talk about some of the issues or challenges with that.
Yes, hi. There are problems. So the issue that we have really is that we're working with medieval literature. So as we said, we're mostly focusing on the Ulster cycle at the moment, which is one part of Irish medieval literature. And although we're working mainly with editions of this text, so that have been created and printed and available to read now, those texts were first written and circulated through manuscripts, and that comes with a bunch of issues that we have to reckon with. As you can see here, you have an example of what a page in a manuscript might look like. This is the first page of the Táin Bocáilne in the Liber na Híre, the Táin being probably the most famous / important text in medieval literature. Already you can see that we're working with, it's a beautiful page, but you have blotches, you have, it has gone through things. And beyond that, really, we're working with texts that are very fluid due to that manuscript tradition, because a manuscript is copied by hand by someone in a monastery, right? And oftentimes we're working with copies of copies of copies of a manuscript that comes with all the sorts of small errors and additions and differences that might happen when you copy text like that. So we end up having not just one text that is very, formatted and strict, but we're actually working with many different versions of a text within a larger corpus of many different versions of many different texts. So, for instance, with the Táin, we have 3 different main versions that we call recensions of the text. A recension specifically is a version that presents significant differences, right, between each version. So episodes that are added or taken out, characters doing different things, right? So we're working already with quite a few different elements here. And that's just working with the core of the text, but we even end up having let's say, interesting elements being added on the periphery of the text as well. So to illustrate that, let's talk about glosses for a second. So glosses are scribal inputs in a manuscript. So basically just notes and commentaries added by the scribe, either in the margin of a text, so marginal glosses, or between the lines of a text, interlinear glosses. And those can be anything, just a commentary on what's happening, a precision, a translation of a passage, something like that, right? So they're not part of the body of the text, but they do bring information about what's going on in there. Now, the thing is, they're often added after the fact, right? The main body of the text is first copied, and then things are added onto it, right? So when it comes to, again, looking at characters and characters' interactions in a text, we end up having weird things happening. So as an example, here you have a nice little example of an interlinear gloss. This is a passage, again, in the Táin, where the wife of Conchover, Mogain, is meeting with Coholin in front of Evan Macha. And here, trust me when I say this is Mogain, her name, and this is as well. And above it, you see that there is a little note written in between the lines. And that gloss tells us that in a different version of the story, it's not Mogain, it's someone called Ferach that meets Coholin, whoever that person is, right? So that's a nice little addition that we get and a new character introduced. But how do we take this into account to our network? Because it's not part of the main text, it's an addition put onto it that reflects also an alternative tradition of the text that we don't have. So again, how do we deal with that? How do we reckon with that? So that's already one problem with glosses that are clearly identifiable. Now, stage above that, we have sometimes what we call incorporated glosses. So those are, again, little lines, passages, a few words that we can identify as having been at some point a gloss, and then in the tradition of copying the text have been integrated into the main body of text. So again, they bring some information about the text, enough that the scribe decided, oh, this is important, we're going to add it to the text. So for instance, here, again, in the Táin, you have a mention of Alecto, the Fury from classical literature. She's mentioned here, and we have right after it a passage here, and the way it's phrased, we can guess that it was a gloss that tells us that Alecto is in fact the Morrigan. So that's very interesting, but those are very much two different characters that are now being conflated with each other in this particular passage. And we know that it is a later addition, but it's also part of the main text now. So we have to take it into account. But also, they're not the same character. It's only the case in this passage, in this text. So again, how do we deal with that? How do we show this in our network that this is a thing that happens specifically in this text in this way? So again, many questions are arising through this. Again, not only are the texts not really fixed, but the characters aren't either. We see that some of them are conflated with each other. Sometimes they might have multiple names as well. There's a whole question of spellings that we're not going to get into. Sometimes they also can be swapped between versions of the story. An example of that can be found in the Táin Bóithreaimhne, where you have Colin meeting a woman red, a guy, and a cow on a road, and they have a chat. And at the end of the text, we're given the name of that woman red. We have two manuscript copies of that story. One manuscript gives Morrigan, one manuscript gives Badov. So again, we have to take into account both of these versions if we were to look at character interactions. And we can't really be sure which one is really the true one, even if that's even a thing. So again, the main challenge that we have in this project really is bridging that gap between our two disciplines. We're working with very, again, unfixed, fluid material that needs to be obviously respected, but we need to fit that into neat little spreadsheets and boxes. So we have to, again, find clear parameters for that, but allow for variations and again, fluidity to respect the material. So I'll give it back to Patrick for some results.
So one of the advantages, of course, of taking a computational approach is that you can just make the decision many times and do simulations and then get some uncertainty around this. Whereas from a qualitative approach, you do kind of have to make a decision. So there's over 100 stories or texts in the Ulster cycle. This is 20 of them which we've done so far. We've started this in November. And here you can see this character, Morrigan, who in one story is this Greek Alecto, and another one might be someone else. So in this version, we've just treated her always as the Morrigan. But then if we do another version where we treat her as a different character, then she'll be less important in this. So at least we can quantify how certain we are about characters. Of the 20 stories we looked at so far, we've got almost 1,000 characters. And we're interested, again, in the sort of characters that are connecting a lot of paths. We're also interested in how much information loss is going to affect what we know. So of these stories, some of them are like only a few lines of a manuscript, others are lots of pages. So 3 of them in particular are very large. So if I do some simulations here where I lose some of these stories, because we know their data set is incomplete, we only have a few hundred, but there are way more out there, there were way more out there. So in some situations, if we lose half of the text that we've looked at, you could still end up just losing minor ones, and you still have most of the characters. You still have almost 900 of your 933 characters. But if you lose your major ones, you could have only 100 characters left. So this is giving us some indication of how much damage could have been done to this corpus. And then I mentioned the characters we're interested in. There's, in this network here, where you have 933 characters, if you start removing characters, suddenly this network gets a lot smaller. And we can see that 5 of them here, if I remove 5 of them, the network goes about half its size. If I remove 17, I get a network of less than 100 characters. So some of these characters are much more important than others, which we knew, but we didn't quite know how important they might have been for the corpus. So then this is just showing the networks with different choices made. But it's still quite early days. We started this in November. It's slightly over 2 years we've got the project. And I guess this is the first time working very closely with a humanities person on this rather than working just purely with the data. So just some kind of reflections we have on what we've learned from working together is just, it's very, very clear to be, and just be certain what your objectives are going in and be clear what you want to do so you don't just kind of do your own thing independently. Communication is essential. You have to use very clear language. I know we use 1 or 2 terms. I use betweenness, use glosses. There's some jargon you can't avoid, but in general, you really have to avoid jargon or be very clear what you mean whenever you define something. You have to be very willing to compromise in your ideas as well. So like my idea initially was quite simple, just like merge all these networks and see who's important, but that might not really be possible. So you have to be able to say, okay, well, we can still do things regardless of this. And I'd say the biggest one is that you've got to be very respectful of other disciplines. Like this is different to, I think, the previous project where here I'm the mathematician wading into someone else's field. And if I come in going, oh, I'm going to solve all your problems with my fancy new tool, I don't think I'm going to get many people wanting to collaborate with me in that. So you have to know there's a whole tradition and culture you're going into. So I think there are some of the main reflections we have. Okay. Thanks very much.
Very interesting discussion. Does anybody have any questions for the guys? Darren?
Thank you. So you mentioned, I guess, that this collaboration is a little bit different in that it's a mathematician going into a different space. And I guess it's a space where mathematics is probably less common than in, say, the medical space. So what would you say the attitude is, and should it change or can it change?
Well, you can maybe talk about your experience as well, but that's true that we rarely collaborate outside our field, even outside of the field of Irish studies. You know, it's already quite rare to have collaborations with even other, you know, humanities project. But this is quite unique, especially in Irish studies. Nothing like that has been done before. And I wish there was more collaboration of this kind, because we can achieve very interesting results that actually show things that we can't really detect otherwise. So yeah, absolutely, if anyone else wants to join, absolutely come. But yeah, no, we tend to be a very close field. It's a small field that doesn't necessarily always socialize very well. So, yeah. Yeah,
from my experience, I've had a lot of mixed reactions. So unsurprisingly, I suppose a lot of the older academics are a little bit suspicious of me coming in with a different idea or with like a different approach, I suppose. The first publication, this was in 2012, and we reached out to a lot of humanities people on kind of using networks to analyze work, and they were interested, but no one wanted to work with us. And then when our first publication came out, it did get a lot of some hostile comments from some people in the community. We went to a lot of conferences, we met a lot of people. It took a long time before I kind of got people willing to work directly with me rather than just be like, that's interesting, and give me advice. So I'd always have people like reading our papers and giving some comments. But until it was only the last few years, really, I've got people very willing to work with me. So I guess I'd sort of really keep pushing it. Persistence is the key, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We might thank our speakers again. So our third pairing is Associate Professor Helen Purtle from MACSI and Professor Ian Kenny from the Department of Physical Education and Sports Sciences here at UL. Helen's an Associate Professor in Statistics, and her research interests are really around latent class analysis, understanding biases in observational longitudinal studies, design and analysis of randomised controlled trials, and the statistical modelling of injury data in elite athletes. Lots of you might know Helen from her work with the Health Research Institute, and just to plug her talk on Thursday with the Ageing Research Centre as well. So that'll be another talk Helen will be giving. So I suppose the latter part of her research interests around working with injury data has led to her collaboration with Ian, who's a professor of biomechanics in PES. And his interests are around injury biomechanics and epidemiology, rugby science, and sport and human performance, including golf, which is very topical at the moment. So together they're going to talk about the work that they're doing with the Irish Rugby Injury Surveillance, or IRIS project, that's looking at tracking and reporting trends in rugby injuries in amateur club athletes, both men and women, and at schoolboy level. So welcome Ian and Helen.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the invitation. These talks are so disparate and varied, and it's very interesting to hear different aspects of how the work is applied. With Professor Tom Cummins, I look after a project for Irish Rugby called IRIS, Irish Rugby Injury Surveillance. It's international, but the remit from Irish Rugby was to provide to World Rugby some information on injuries in our athletes. As a Tier 1 rugby playing country, that's mandated across the world. And with Helen Purtle and with about 15 or 20 other academics across physiology, general medicine, psychology, we answer questions for both World Rugby and Irish Rugby to help player welfare. It sits within rugby science in the Sport and Human Performance Research Centre that I co-direct with Professor Giles Warrington. And there is a lot of other topics involved. We have about 70 members of that centre, all looking at different questions. Of about 10 or 12 of them are into rugby. Context in Ireland is that there are 4 provinces, as we know, and the national teams, men and women, and we don't look after them. Those injury epidemiology questions are answered in-house by Irish Rugby. Everything else below that comes within our remit. We have about 2,000 players which we work with. That's a small snapshot of the 209,000 that are in the country. But over the years, it provides us with a rich data set that we can work with. It's been going since 2016. So individual years don't provide us the information. But now working with Helen in MACSI, we have 10 years of data, and we can see trends and see how law changes impacted by World Rugby can make a difference for player welfare. We have a lot of partners, UPMC Medical, which have come into the country in recent years, in Pittsburgh with their concussion expertise, with IRC, with Erasmus Mundus. We've been able to work internationally with quite a few partners. But our main funding partner is Irish Rugby. So internationally, there's only a few countries. France, New Zealand, England are looking at epidemiology of the women's game. We've been looking at the longest now in terms of 10 years, providing really good, rich data set for World Rugby to answer questions on. And for the men's game at the All-Ireland League level, We're tracking injuries as well. They might not look underage. These are schoolboy players, and our work looks at them as well. We've started to look at the underage female as well, but the structure of those games and competitions aren't as prevalent yet as the schoolboy level. So that's just the last 2 years we don't have trends on, but they're starting. I won't go into some of the detail of results, but this is the likes of the information we provide back to World Rugby and IRFU. So it's where on the body injuries occur. Highlighted in red and the most frequent. And we have 2 points of data here. One is percentage, which we will typically talk about in our papers and with the media, because that's more readily understandable. But our work with MACSI and with Helen looks at the other number, which is, as you can see for the head, 4.6. That is injury rate per 1,000 hours. So that's using a consensus statement that the International Olympic Committee put out for all sports across the world to use, so that we can compare rugby rates against soccer, against basketball, against fencing, and we have a standard at which we can look at risk and player welfare for all athletes. I was looking at this data yesterday with my 7-year-old daughter, and she asked, why don't they wear helmets? A very good point, but it's not American football, and there's propensity there for leading with the head, although it may initially reduce injuries. It's a whole different question. So some insight from young academics as well is good. So left and then right is the women's, and there are different injuries for the women's game. Typically, women come into the sport of rugby later in life. They're 18, 19 years of age in college, rather than underage at schools level. And technical aspects of the tackle, for example, are not as honed. And we see that a little bit in some of the injury they present. So it's really important that we look at both sexes individually. And at the underage level, we separate our data because they're, for GDPR reasons, they're underage data. Again, another example of the data we collect on the pitch. These are the positions. And this is a snapshot of just 1 year. But most importantly, when we add this up for 10 years, and we're funded now through to 2030, we can see a picture of what positions on the pitch the strength conditioning coaches and the coaches can start to put prevention strategies in place that will look at how they will protect those particular players. And typically left wing for the backs, the forwards will always have more injuries because they're the first line of attack and first line of defence. This is courtesy of a colleague, Dr. John Mulvihill in Bernal Institute, who looks at concussion for us. So we track concussion rates, and unfortunately it is a risk of the game, and it's something that World Rugby is looking really, really seriously at in the last number of years. Well, certainly since 1995, since the game turned professional. Then you're on the right, when a contact happens, this is not reality of what happens. There is meninges, which is the sheath covering the brain, which stops that excessive movement, but there is still movement. And when there is a shearing force movement in the brain, the neurons die. So with Dr. John Mulvihill, what we're looking at is collecting the information over the last 10 years of rates of concussions and how they happen in circumstance, and his biomarker work, and seeing are there inflammation biomarkers at 1 hour, 24 hours, 21 days after injury that he can help to diagnose concussion, because there is no clinical tool for diagnosis. And just finally, before I hand over to Helen, we report into IRFU, into World Rugby. So World Rugby today and tomorrow have their medical symposium where they're talking about all aspects of the game, skin abrasions, artificial pitches, so that information can be passed on to them, and they use that to change their laws. 1 and 2 is our core of our work, where we collect information at the schoolboy level and male and female injury surveillance. And then we hand over the data pretty much to our PhD researchers. And there's 10 in the system at the minute, looking at different research questions. And they might be breast health and impact and exercise, breast health and rugby, concussion profiling, training load and how often people train and how often become injured, how that's relevant for professional underage game. But our big problem is how we answer questions when we have a data set like this. So this is 10 years of data. Red are concussion. There are about 5,000 unfortunate injuries. Some are catastrophic. And we need somebody to help us decipher from the design stage, as was said earlier in the talk, right through to the analysis at the end. So I'll let Helen talk a little bit about how she does that.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so I've been working with IRIS probably since 2018, I think. Time flies. I suppose as a statistician, when working and trying to model data, the quality of the data is very important. And I think, you know, maybe what Ian has underestimated here and what he said is the work that has been put in by the IRIS researchers led by Ian and Tom into the collection of the data, monitoring the data, contacting the clubs, following up, contacting schools, auditing the data. You know, it's a pleasure then to work with this data, knowing that so much has gone into collecting it very well. So it's prospective collection. It doesn't rely on recall, which is important. So it gives reassurance of the quality of the data. Also, the categorization of type of injury, location, mechanism is informed by the International Olympic Committee consensus on injury surveillance. So again, there's a lot of thinking that has gone into the background of collecting the data that has allowed valid and reliable measures of these important things that we need to look at. And after that, I suppose then in some ways my job is an awful lot easier than it would have been otherwise. So statistical modelling then on this really good data can provide insights into patterns, trends, incidents of injury. As Ian mentioned, one of the important measures that we look at when we look at amateur rugby is match injury incident rate. So what we have, because of the work that's gone into collecting the data, is the number of matches that have been played in the amateur league, and then that allows us to compute an exposure, which is computed as the number of players in the team, the match length, and the number of matches. And then from this, we can compute an injury rate. So an example there from the IRIS report is that the overall injury rate of men's clubs 2023-24 was 36 injuries per 1,000 match player hours, and that translates to, on average, 1 injury per player. So a person has to play, on average, 21 matches to receive an injury. So it just gives an idea as to the injury rate, and as Ian was saying, it can be compared across other countries and other sports. Something that we're very cognizant of when we work with data as statisticians is taking account of uncertainty in the data, the sample size. So it's very important to put confidence intervals around these estimates, and we can do that. And I just want to kind of show you, I suppose, some results here. So Poisson regression we use to put some confidence intervals around and be able to compare groups. So for example, this was a publication that was looking at schools rugby, and we were able to show then that the forwards are receiving more injuries, so their incident rate is approximately 60% higher compared to backs, and we have some confidence around that as well. We can look at the type of injuries then that people get, and also where they get those injuries, the burden, and you know, there's, just as Ian was saying, there's so much data that we can really start to, you know, delve deeper into. This is a publication from 2021 on the amateur rugby scene for men and women, and really what we can see here is that the top 3 injuries are head, shoulders and ankles for male players, and head, knee and ankle for female players. And we can see as well the severity, and severity is kind of a skewed variable, so it's represented there as median and interquartile range, and that is the number of days that they're out really with that injury. So again, it's just important information to get there. So yeah, it's great. We have a lot more data. So we've 10 seasons, nearly, well, 10 years almost. So this will allow us to look at the analysis of injury trends over time. So looking at the impact of changes like the tackle height, whether that will hopefully make a difference for the better. We have larger sample sizes, which is really good for looking further into some of the mechanisms, some of the locations, but also looking into the female rugby players, which is a big part of what IRIS is looking at doing, which is very, very important. Certainly an area that we need to look more into. We're also looking at longitudinal analysis of the concussion injuries, and that is PhD student Laura Power, who is supervised by Ian and Tom and John Mulvihill, as well as with the collaboration with UPMC. And then, and kind of exciting new start then will be a new PhD student, hopefully starting in September, where that person will be supervised with myself and Tom. And that would be great to look really at all of this data that we have now collected over time. So collaboration, it's just, I think as a statistician, it's just fantastic to be able to work with different, really, really good researchers. This is a picture just of a trip that we went as part of Erasmus last year to Stellenbosch, and it was just amazing. I was the only statistician in the village, but it was just brilliant to talk to, these experts, to really find out what the data means, like where it was collected, why different trends were happening. It was just like in a sweet shop. So I suppose data alone is not enough. We need the experts. We need collaboration to make it all come together. So thanks.
Thanks very much, guys. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks. Some of the stats are very interesting. I was just wondering, looking at the discrepancy between the wings, do you have a hypothesis why left wing across sexes gets so much more injuries than right?
Are there any rugby coaches in before I say anything? Players? Typically, the utility will be that the left wing will come into the play more because of the way the scrum is positioned on the pitch. So they will wrap around and have a utility type of presence on the pitch. So they get involved in that a little bit more than the right wing. That's just something that through schoolboy rugby, it's not taught, but when you get into the amateur level, that's what happens. So unfortunately, left wing gets the injuries.
Thank you very much,
Super.
guys.
Thanks.
Finally then, last but certainly not least, we have Associate Professor David O'Sullivan from MACSI and Associate Professor Paul Maher from the Department of Psychology here in UL. David is an Associate Professor in Statistics and Data Analytics, and like Padraig, his research interests are around developing models for complex networks, information diffusion on networks, and opinion dynamics. So some of his work looked at the relationship between social networks of users and associated sentiment of tweets around the Irish marriage referendum in 2015. He's worked closely with the psychology department for a number of years now on attitude networks, including this collaboration with Paul. Paul's research is around emotions, attitudes, political orientation, and really how emotions related to knowledge and sense-making influence the political attitudes that people hold. And again, how attitude networks influence people's political identification. Again, very, very topical at the moment. So today they're going to tell us a little bit, I think, about DAFINET, which is an ERC project that's led by Professor Mike Quayle in the Department of Psychology. So welcome, David and Paul.
Thanks very much, Norma. Just to start off, it's a very old picture of myself there. It's in tradition of most academics. It's about 10 years old, so aged a bit since then. So myself and Paul are going to talk to you about our work on attitude networks. So this is interdisciplinary work between MACSI and psychology. And just a little bit about myself and how I came to UL initially. So after completing my undergraduate degree in 2013, I actually did an internship in the University of Limerick in MACSI, working on a project to predict gas usage for a company. Now, it was actually a great project for myself, because it's the very first time after learning maths and statistics for 4 years that I actually got to apply a project where there was an end user who was very interested in the models that we can generate, and it was a very nice collaborative atmosphere around that project where we got to work with an industry interested party. I enjoyed it so much that I actually wanted to come here to do my PhD, and thankfully there was money for me to do so. So I continued doing some industry projects, but my main focus was working in the area of computational social science. So the idea around computational social science is that you want to build mathematical and statistical models to try and understand how information spreads. Well, my interest is how information spreads through networks. So you think like things like X or Twitter. You have a post and you're interested in actually what are the mechanisms, can you describe and find the mechanisms by which things spread through those kind of networks? And can you understand, say, things like how the network structure might impact how information might spread between communities of maybe left-leaning or right-leaning individuals as well? And as Norma mentioned, I did some work around the Irish marriage referendum that led to my work with Paul as well, where we took a large amount of Twitter data and were able to use that to find communities of individuals who are leaning towards voting yes and leaning towards voting no. And then the idea of that is that you could use that to try and analyse how those communities were interacting internally with each other and interacting across between the communities as well. So part of the PhD was building tools for computational social science. Now, all good things, we had to finish up the PhD at some stage, so I ended up doing 2 postdocs and ended up coming back to Limerick in 2020, joining a member of faculty and within the department as well. So it was actually during my seminar that I was giving in 2020 on this very work, where Paul was lurking somewhere in the background, where I was discussing this work where we took a large amount of data, we were able to find these individuals who are left and right leaning, or sorry, leaning towards voting no and voting yes around this referendum. And I was discussing, like, actually, how do you build statistical and mathematical models that can tell you actually how likely those patterns you're seeing in the actual network are due to chance? And the normal kind of statistical models tend to break down in this setting. So we were able to do some work. We were able to figure out actually how likely those kind of patterns that you might see on those networks are likely due to chance or not. You might observe a certain pattern of yes-leaning individuals tend to follow each other more often. That is not just explained by network structure alone. And so Paul asked a couple of leading questions where he was clearly interested in maybe applying similar techniques in a slightly different setting. And once after the seminar finished, we had a little bit of discussion, and he talked to me a little bit about DAFINet and the kind of projects that, or the kind of things that he wanted to build within DAFINet and himself and Mike Quayle. And so I got very excited and jumped on board. And so Paul is going to talk a little bit more about, well, how we came to work on the DAFINet project, what the DAFINet project involves, and then we're going to circle back for myself at the end. So turn you over to Paul.
Yeah, so I started my PhD here in 2013 with Professor Eric Igu in the social psychology department, and I was interested in epistemic emotions and political polarization. So epistemic emotions are a class of negative experience that can be distinguished from other negative experiences by the fact that they trigger sense-making and kind of pattern recognition, or a desire for pattern recognition and things like that. So we were able to distinguish them from other states on these 2 dimensions. And we focused in particular on the experience of disillusionment as a kind of quintessential epistemic emotion. And we were interested in how increases in these experiences, experiencing disillusionment and other negative epistemic states, could lead people on an individual level to adopt more extreme political attitudes or engage in extreme political or radical action. So we observed that, first of all, looking at individuals in their everyday life, how much they're experiencing epistemic states and what are their current political views, and also how different geopolitical events, like in one study we focused on the Brexit referendum result on the first election of Donald Trump, and showing longitudinally how over time that led to more extreme political views and how this could be explained by these epistemic emotions. So a very simplistic overview of the whole idea. Some person experiences disillusionment. This triggers a desire to make sense of things, and maybe pattern recognition and things like that. And that at the individual level leads this person to adopt more extreme views, engage in more extreme political action. But the thing is, it requires something happening at a social level as well. Okay, so it requires the existence of social categories that people can engage with that can then lead to this extremity. So that was the nuance that I was missing in my approach, I guess. The kind of experimental methods I used didn't allow me to access the social level of information, social level of analysis. So after a brief stint in UCD, I came back to join Mike Quayle's DAFINet project. So DAFINet is dynamic attitude fixing in networks. It was Mike Quayle's ERC grant idea. And he was interested in how attitudes become fixed in social identities and ideologies, how they become packaged together and then fixed over time and across individuals, how they become packaged in groups. So if you think of two typical attitudes like being strongly Christian and also being strongly in favour of the death penalty, and they don't make much logical sense, but in certain nations they go together very commonly, and in other nations they don't go together very commonly, would be the opposite. And so why is this the case? What's fixing these attitudes together? How is social context fixing attitudes together across different states? So DAFINet was a really interdisciplinary group. We had the kind of social psychology side of the group. And of course, this is where I came across Dave and watched his seminar. And we had Padraig as well, and Kevin Burke and a couple of others here. And working together to try and solve this problem, or to try and understand how we could analyze this problem. And the theory was quite simple. Mike's ideas were quite simple, that as individuals interact and share attitudes, agreement creates links between these individuals, some affiliation at the individual level, but then also at a social level, attitudes become fixed as they're commonly held together by different individuals. So if I hold two attitudes together and I see a lot of other people hold those two attitudes together, they develop some kind of social resonance. And we knew we would need some network methods to investigate this, to understand how individual level interactions can create or produce social identity. But psychologists, we do use some network analysis, but it comes in an OR package, and really it's just correlations, visualizing correlations really. With MACSI, we were able to design these kind of bespoke networks, and we realized we needed a bipartite structure. Individuals would become, so we would have one layer where nodes are individuals, like a social layer, and they become linked indirectly through the attitudes that they hold. And then we would have the identity layer, the symbolic layer, where attitudes become linked indirectly when they're held in common by two individuals. And key to this was the fact that we can visualize these networks using standard survey data sets. Okay, so we didn't have to change our methods all that much, and we could take data sets we already have and take publicly available data sets and visualize these networks and observe changes in polarization across groups or between groups over time. So what you can see here is data that was visualized using the American National Election Survey in 2012, and this is the agent layer of the network. And as you might gather, the blue nodes are Democrats and the red nodes are Republicans, people who identify as Republican. So you can see we're already capturing a group structure. And then we could observe what happens. So that's 2012, and then there's 2016, and then there's 2020. Okay, so you see extreme polarization, social identities and social realities becoming more disparate over time. So as well as that network, those specific network methods, we built a general framework then that we could use, where Dave would be able to do some simulations using these networks as a structure to simulate what would happen over time at the social level. And then I would do experimental work where I would test these mechanisms at the individual level. And then as novel mechanisms emerged, for example, through experimentation, we found that people are more likely to flip their attitudes. So if they hold one extreme, they're likely to flip to the opposite extreme when they change an attitude, rather than gradually change their attitude over time. And then we can investigate this for plausibility with the computational work. And then finally, the final part of the package is then we observe longitudinally these changes over time and see if what we're observing, the mechanisms that we hypothesize in the computational work and what we're observing as results plays out empirically. So yeah, it was a very successful has been and is an ongoing successful collaboration. I think we published 19 papers together over the last 4 years, and generated a lot of research funding at the time as well. And that's mainly led by the fact that Mike Quayle got another ERC grant. Yeah, it wouldn't have been possible without this collaboration. It wasn't all plain sailing. So Dave has some examples of.
This sounds a little bit ominous, but it's not too ominous. I suppose when you have a successful collaboration, especially an interdisciplinary collaboration, it's important that you have good communication. And when we think about good communication, we normally think about it being very pristine, accurate thing. But when you're working newly with a group, it's normally about how you get, or for me, it's how you get towards a very concrete understanding of where the other person is coming from, not necessarily just, you kind of have to embrace the mess, I suppose. And a nice example of this was where we had a DAFINet journal club where we all proposed a paper, and I proposed a paper and we all read it, and then I would lead the discussion on this particular paper. And I picked one of my favorite papers that I came across from my PhD, and didn't think this was going to be a particularly contentious paper. I thought it was on very safe ground with a statistical methodology paper, but it turned out to be quite contentious, to my surprise. And just a little bit of highlights about what the paper was about. The idea of the paper was relatively simple, is that if you have a network structure and you're interested in trying to observe how things like maybe adoption of a product diffuses through that network, you want to try to pull apart two things from that. You want to pull apart the individual level adoption due to peer influence, where my friends see me with a phone, they're like, that's a nice phone, I'm going to go out and buy that phone. From network-driven homophily, which homophily is the idea of birds of a feather flock together. I'm more similar to my friends. We share similar preferences for products, so we're going to buy similar products, so they can be correlated events. So this paper has a nice way of pulling those two things apart. But as we were going through the discussion, and I was leading the discussion, it became obvious that something was getting lost in the interdisciplinary translation between the kind of stats side and the psychologist side. And I knew this because there was a forest of hands shooting up on the Zoom call about, like, I don't understand the results, these don't make any sense. And we went around for a very long time trying to figure out exactly what was going on. What actually ended up happening is that this term homophily that we'd been using for months had actually a very subtle but distinct meaning in a psychological setting versus a network setting. It turned out that we never actually came to terms with that. We were able to figure that out. And then when I was talking about homophily from that point on, I was very specifically to say, this is the type of homophily that we're going to be dealing with, right? And I suppose that's why one of the main reasons why our kind of collaboration works is that we're very comfortable in being confused in each other's company. And I think that's a very important thing for us to be able to do. And when we're working together, it's important for us to kind of leave our discipline's baggage at the door, right? So we have to be very good at, like, as you're saying, we need to maybe possibly relearn some things, relearn some new terminology that we had very set in our head. And once we're able to do that over a long period of time, I think, well, hopefully not too long a period of time, we developed a lot of trust in actually how we work together, and that we were able to always kind of get to a common understanding of what I was meaning and what other individuals in the group was actually meaning. And this was one element that made our collaborations very effective for that DAFINet project, but it's something that we actually carry forward for all the other projects that we are engaged in. So we have multiple other projects going forward as well. So yeah, thanks very much, and I'll happily take your questions.
Ian, have any questions for David and Paul?
In terms of political extremes, have you taken inspiration in the spread of communism or Nazism like in the past century?
Sorry, I didn't get that question, sorry.
Have you taken inspiration from the spread of communism or Nazism in the past century?
I think I took main inspiration from right-wing populism during like 2016 or so. That was, you know, that was where we could observe the emergence of rapid polarization during that time. So that's what I was focused on, more the emergence of right-wing populism, say, over the last 25 years rather than, I don't know, communism 100 years ago or so. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I was more focused on, actually, we have all these new social structures that we actually didn't have previously. So how would you use those to maybe detect things like polarization that, you know, Twitter didn't exist back when in the 1940s when, you know, communism was more of a thing.
Thank your speakers again. So just to wrap up, hopefully you'll have gotten a flavour of the breadth of the things that we do in MACSI. I suppose some key themes coming out here around what makes a successful collaboration, communication, respect for each other's disciplines, etc. I've just put up here a short slide if you'd like to have a chat with us, but I suppose the first step for anybody who might want to collaborate with us is to contact James McCormack at his email address there at the end of the slide. Just to say thank you very much to everyone for coming today. It's been great to see a full room. Thanks to Yvonne and all of the research team, office team, and all the lads here as well who have made this a very smooth operation. If you'd like to chat to anyone, I just ask that you vacate the room. There's teas and coffees across the hallway. There is another event on here afterwards, so we'd be happy to chat with anybody after the event. So thanks all again, and hope you enjoy the rest of Research Week.